So we are now going to look at Regulation 9 that covers protective clothing. So what is protective clothing? So protective clothing is clothing that a food handler wears in a food facility to, number one, protect the food from any contamination, and number two, to protect themselves from any injury that may occur in their work environment. So the PPE could include things like aprons, could include things like boots that they are wearing in the food facility, as well as hairnets. So all these things are meant to, most importantly, protect the food as well as ensure that the food handler is protected. So now let's look at Regulation 9, Sub-Regulation 1, what it covers. A person may not handle or be allowed to handle food without wearing suitable protective clothing as specified in Sub-Regulation 2. So under Sub-Regulation 2, it states that the PPE must be clean and neat when the person begins to handle the food, because obviously if it's not clean and neat, then it can result in contamination being introduced into the food. It must at all times during the handling of the food be in such a clean condition and be of such design and material that it cannot contaminate the food. That is self-explanatory. So you do not want your PPE to now introduce the food. Maybe it has loose buttons, maybe it's made of decorative material that can end up getting to the food, for example, cotton or whatever that it may be on your PPE. It must be in such design that food cannot come into direct contact with your skin, excluding the hands. Why is that? Human beings are naturally carriers of bacteria or germs, as we normally call them. So if that particular bacteria gets introduced into the food, it may replicate or it may multiply, and then by the time the consumer eats your food, there may be so many of them that they may cause an illness to the consumer. So a typical example of that is Staphylococcus aureus. A lot of people carry it. It may not cause any harm to them. They may be perfectly fine, but once it's transferred to the food, then it may be harmful to the consumer who eats that food, and they may develop food poisoning symptoms. Then under 9.3, we look at visitors. If visitors come to your facility, they must also be issued with PPE. I've seen quite a lot of times that visitors are allowed to stroll through the food facilities without wearing necessary PPE. See, if a food handler wears PPE, they are actually less risk to the food than a visitor, because a food handler works in that environment. They are familiar with the practices, the hygiene practices here. They have been trained and they're fully aware of what contaminant they can introduce into the food. But a visitor, for an example, a random electrician, somebody coming to do maintenance, may not necessarily be aware of what contaminant that they carry. So it will be a problem if they're allowed to go into the facility without wearing PPE, because they are in fact also human beings. If a food handler may contaminate the food, then a visitors may contaminate too. They might introduce contaminant to your facility, and it's even worse for them. They are more of high risk than food handlers that can be trained, that have been trained, that are fully aware of their responsibility. So you must ensure that the visitors are also issued with PPE when they go into the food handling facility. So now let's look at the three functions of PPE. The first one, most importantly, is to protect the food from contamination. The second one is also to protect the food handler, so that in the process of preparing the food, they do not get injured or harmed in any way. Then number three, if all these things are done right, food handler protects themselves from harm, from injury. The food is prepared in a hygienic manner. There is no way that the food handler introduces any contaminants to the food. Obviously, then when the food gets to the consumer, it will still be safe to consume, and it will not cause any harm, depending on the risk of your facility as well and the controls that we have. So the most important things to mind here is that the PPE must be in line with these requirements. So the shoes must have reinforced toes to protect from sharp objects being dropped on toes and feet. It must also be slip resistant to ensure that there is no way that a food handler in the process of preparing food can fall on the slippery floor and get injured, then the apron as well that they wear must be made from thick, durable, and fire-resistant fabric to prevent any hot liquids or to prevent burns from hot liquids or even chemical that they could be using in the facility. And then obviously a hairnet or chef's net, hat, and beard net, to prevent any hair from beard or from the head or from your hair from falling into the food and resulting in contamination, because obviously hair contains bacteria that can cause a food poisoning when the consumer consumes that food. Then the cleaning staff, you must also provide them with necessary PPE. That could be rubber gloves if they're mixing the chemicals, because if a chemical comes into contact with the hands that are not protected, then can result in a chemical injury. A waterproof apron that can protect from any chemicals that can get to the food handler, as well as to ensure that the PPE of staff members does not get stained. If they are working with anything that contains acid, I know from having worked in a lab, that can also cause damage to personal clothing. Non-slip shoes to prevent a food handler slippering on a slippery floor, which could cause a serious injury to them. So that is also something that must be considered. So while they are cleaning, they can fall on the floor, and obviously that would not be an ideal situation. It is also very important that the PPE is kept clean at all times, because if it's not kept clean, so the PPE can end up being a risk to the food preparation area, because you'll end up reintroducing hazards to the food through dirty equipment that may contain bacteria, that may contain chemical residues, and many other contaminants, resulting in the food being unsafe for the consumer. Thank you.